Welcome to FARSIGHT Friday. My name is Farah Bala. I'm the founder of FARSIGHT. We are a leadership organizational development agency, consultancy. We prioritize equity, diversity, inclusion, anti-oppression work as a core leadership competency. And FARSIGHT Friday is our community podcast that started in 2020 during the multiple pandemics that the world was going through, and has since, over the last 4 years, become a space of listening and learning. We use this space to dissect very crucial conversations that are important to the times that we're in, to the evolving culture that we are witnessing and developing together. Today's conversation is around Arab heritage in the Western world. April was Arab American Heritage Month, and we are very excited that we get to amplify the community and this conversation at this time. I always say that 1 month or 1 day isn't enough for any specific community. It's about a practice of living every day. So I'm personally thrilled that we get to uplift the community in non-Arab American Heritage Month time. I am thrilled to introduce our guests to you for today. We have Karen Kmeid, we have Jumana Salamey, we have Jamil Khoury, and Matt Jaber Stiffler. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm going to hand it over to you to please introduce yourselves to us. Tell us what you do and what is your migration story to the West?
My name is Jumana Salamey. I use the pronouns she, her, hers. I am the Deputy Director at the Arab American National Museum located in Dearborn, Michigan. I'm also the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee Chair for our parent organization, Access, which is the largest Arab American nonprofit in the country. It's a social service agency, and the museum is one of the national institutions that functions under this larger social service agency. I've been with the museum since the inception in 2005. I've had various roles, most currently as Deputy Director. I've been in this role for about 8 to 9 years now. I oversee day-to-day operations, staff support, program management, fiscal, a little bit of HR, anything and everything that the museum may need to operate in its best capacity. I kind of have my hands in. My migration story, I'm here by way of my parents who immigrated from Lebanon in the late 1960s due to just economic situation after the Civil War in Lebanon. They decided to leave and come here to Michigan. My dad had some relatives who were able to get him a job at Ford Motor Company. He worked in a city called Livonia, working in the transmission department of Ford. He did that for about 48 years, and he retired from Ford Motor Company. And they planted roots in Dearborn and had their 3 out of 5 of their children here in America. My oldest 2 siblings were in Lebanon and came with them in the late 60s, and we've been here ever since. So Dearborn is my home. I work in Dearborn now. I got married. I stayed in Dearborn. Now I have 2 beautiful boys who I also plan on raising here in Dearborn.
I'm Jamil Khoury. I am the founding co-executive artistic director of Silk Road Rising, which is a Chicago-based arts and education nonprofit organization. We showcase the stories of Silk Road peoples, so West Asian, North African, South Asian, East Asian. We use the historic Silk Road as a sort of geographic guide, also as a metaphor for cultural interchange. We are best known for live theater, and we also do digital media and video plays and arts education and arts advocacy work. We've been around for 20 plus years, so this year is technically our 20th anniversary, and lots of plans for the next 20 years. My immigration story, my family's immigration story, my father came to the US as an engineering student. I always thought in 1953, but one of my siblings said 1951 a few weeks ago. And so now I think there's a little confusion, but early 50s. You know, over time, he met the woman who was to become my mom, and stayed and made a life in the Chicago area. On my mother's side, her mother came to the US in 1927 from Poland, and her father's parents in 1893 from Slovakia, which was then part of Hungary. So I am very much a mixed heritage Arab and Slavic American.
Hi everyone, I'm Karen Kmeid. I was born in Montreal, Canada, and a bit like Jumana's story, my parents decided to pack their things and move back to Lebanon when I was 6. You know, they had to run away from the beautiful country because of the political turmoil and civil war, and they missed their families, the food, the neighbors, the mountains, and the beach. So, you know, as a young woman, I spent so much time fighting countless biases, gender, race, sexual orientation. But as beautiful and as rich as the Arab world is, corruption is still very much at the forefront. So I came back to Montreal 10 years ago to give myself a chance to thrive without these unfortunate limitations. So I studied in Lebanon at the Lebanese American University in international business, but then I came back to Montreal and did my graduate studies in management. Now I work for Airbnb for almost 3 years in claims, but this year I decided to take a leadership role in an employee resource group as the global Arab lead. And this involves leading the group's initiatives and activities that support Airbnb's commitment to diversity, equity, inclusion. You know, it's about implementing programs, events, initiatives, and fostering partnerships with external stakeholders. Yeah, so that's about it for me.
I have a couple of roles that I play. My name is Matt Jaber Stiffler. I am the director of a new institution of Access. Access is the organization that Jumana was talking about, the largest Arab American community nonprofit in the country, based in Michigan. One of their institutions is the Arab American National Museum, which is pictured behind me, where I've worked for 12 years. But I'm now the director of the Center for Arab Narratives, which is a research institution that facilitates and shares research on the Arab and MENA communities, with the goal of improving the well-being of the communities. So we work with any kind of university-based researcher, scholar, health professionals that want to do research on the community or with the community, and we help facilitate that. And we've been doing this work for about 6 years. What we do with that research is pretty unique. We then put it onto our social media at Twitter and Instagram at Arab Narratives. And we try to take the research that's being done and put it into usable, accessible information for the community. And so it's been a really fun journey to work on those things. I also am a lecturer in Arab and Muslim American Studies at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, where I got my PhD in 2010. Originally, I'm from Western Pennsylvania. My mother's family came from Lebanon in 1900. They were among the first, what we call the first period of immigration from Arabic-speaking countries to the US, which started in about the 1880s. And so they were sort of solidly in that first period of immigration, settled in Western Pennsylvania, were store owners and peddlers and those kinds of things. And then eventually when I grew up, all the Lebanese, and my family's Orthodox Christian, so all of the Lebanese Orthodox Christians in my hometown were into owning bars and taverns. So I grew up thinking, you know, knowing Lebanese people just owned bars and taverns. That's what we all did. So that was kind of a fun way to grow up. You know, the four of us on here represent the Lebanese diaspora of Arab America, which is the oldest portion and one of the largest portions but it's certainly not all of it. There's, our community is extremely diverse, and we're happy to talk about the ways that diversity impacts all of our work.
Just listening to all of your stories, thank you so much for sharing that. And like, there's this strong Lebanese heritage presence here, which is incredible. And thank you for naming that there is so much more to Arab heritage than Lebanon. So I want to start off with this question, right? Because there is a vastness. The last time I felt this was when we did one Farsight Friday in 2020 on South Asian identity and the South Asian diaspora and the multitude of communities, cultures, faiths that constitute that. And it's very similar in terms of that vastness with Arab heritage. So for those who are, and we have a question as well, so I'll just read it out, which is similar to where I'd like to take this. I'm interested in understanding what nations are people typically from that leads to an Arab identity, and where has the Arab diaspora concentrated specifically in the West? If you could lend some insight and context into the intersection of faith, geography, and ethnicity and culture as how it constitutes Arab heritage.
The best way to describe the Arab community is it's extremely diverse, and it's changed multiple times over the last 150 years based on things that are happening in the homeland, political tensions, civil strife, war, but also in the US based on who they're letting in at the time, immigration legislation. And it's not just the US. So I'll start with saying that Arabic-speaking folks have been migrating all over the world from Arab countries. And the US is known for its big population, but the largest population of Arabic-speaking people of Arabic-speaking ancestry per capita is in Brazil. Brazil has a huge Arab population, and so does a lot of South and Central America and Australia and many parts of West Africa and throughout Europe. So it's a really broad diaspora, in Canada, of course, and Mexico. So I'm going to speak mainly about the United States, is that Arabs have been settling anywhere in the United States where they could find work. You find huge pockets in metropolitan Detroit, New York, New Jersey is a huge place for Arab immigrants right now. It's really hot for Egyptian and Palestinian immigrants in New Jersey. There's some really cool things happening, cool communities there. Florida, Chicago, Los Angeles, San Francisco, Texas, all over Texas, Boston. So there's Arab communities everywhere. They usually coalesce around a specific church or mosque that was established 100 years ago that the community is built up around. So it's really hard to encapsulate the community because they can come from any of the 22 Arab countries. They can be like me, whose families came 4 generations ago. They can be folks that show up a few weeks ago as migrants or refugees. So it's just to put it in a very brief perspective, is that it's very diverse and changes all the time, and it's hard to encapsulate.
I identify as being first generation. My parents obviously were born and raised in Lebanon and came here. I think one of the things, Farah, to your point about intersectionality of like religion and culture and identity and all of this, I think for me personally, something that I noticed within the Dearborn community, and more so when I started doing some educational work at the museum, is that it was really hard for people to separate culture and religion. For some reason, there was like this assumption that all Arab Americans are Muslim, all Arab Americans are from, the same region, all Arab Americans practice things the same. So in my line of work at the museum, especially, and also in the community, I think having conversations is trying to separate like the cultural practices with the religious practices, and also uplifting and elevating the fact that there are a variety of religious practices that exist in the Arab world. And there's also a variety of religious practices that exist obviously in the Western world, and how people choose to practice their religion. So like we used to get questioned a lot at the museum, like, how do you identify? oh, you're Muslim, how come you don't wear a scarf? Or, do you pray 5 times a day? Or do you do this or do that? And also, I think there was this perception that if you're from the Arab American community and you are Muslim and you wear the head covering, that you practice the same way. So we've spent a lot of time kind of deconstructing like what that looks like, so that there's a clear distinction between like cultural practices and religious practices, and also leaving space for people to share how they live day to day and how they express their culture and their identity. Lastly, I'll just note, and some work that Matt has also worked on, and he'll probably get into a little deeper a little later on in the conversation. But the whole issue of identity within itself and the complexity. So there are Arab Americans that identify by just saying, hey, I'm Arab American, but some who identify as their country of origin. I'm Lebanese Muslim, I'm Lebanese Christian, I'm whatever, what have you. So there's even this whole layer of identity, and what does it mean to be Arab, and what does it mean to be Arab American, which we've had, a unique perspective at the museum, because we do have now the Center of Arab Narratives, and we also have a library and research division that also, looks at oral histories and interviews people. So it's just interesting, the whole notion of like identity and culture and religion and the intersectionalities. So I just wanted to name that as well.
I think that religion and culture piece is, when I think of my own sort of Arab identity and Syrian identity, it's so shaped by a church community that I was raised in, which also Orthodox Christian, Eastern Orthodox, and the whole congregation, or most of the congregation, were immigrants and the children of immigrants from Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, and Jordan. And so my sense of Arabness was really, shaped by a faith tradition and a faith calendar and relationships to other Eastern Christians from the Middle East. So it wasn't until I was like 13 or 14 that I came to the realization that there are actually more Muslims in the Arab world than Christians, because I assumed our world was sort of the Orthodox, the Maronites, and the Melkites, and we would go to each other's events and so forth. And my father was always very active, and I find that people kind of want to erase the religious differences between, or the religious pluralism that exists within Arab America. And many people will project a Muslim identity on me. Now, I married a Muslim man, and so I married into a South Asian Muslim family. And it is often assumed that I changed my name to Jamil, and that I converted to Islam. And then I have to explain, that I sort of came as Jamil, and that there is this Eastern Christian heritage. But I don't know. I think there is this strange resistance to anything but a hegemonic understanding of Arabness and Muslimness, or that conflation, which I think betrays the reality that so many of us live.
Having this conversation, this specific conversation, is, for me, for example, my parents didn't raise me like religiously. My dad's Maronite, my mom's Greek Orthodox, but we didn't go to church every Sunday or whatnot. But when I moved to Montreal and I said I'm Lebanese, one of the first questions that people would ask me is, oh, are you Muslim or Christian? I didn't know what to do with that. Why are you asking me this? Does it even matter? And yeah, it's just food for thought, really. And other things is like, if I don't like pork, for example, and if I don't, am like, no, I'm not ordering the hot dog. It's like, oh, are you Muslim? Little things like that show up in our everyday lives that just are things to think about.
I'm so glad that you are diving into these I call labels of a certain name sounds from this particular faith, and there is so much nuance and complexity and migration movement, right? And if we, in an effort to simplify an external understanding, we homogenize so much, and we lose uniqueness. Is Christianity and Islam the only two faiths that constitute Arab countries? That's one question. And the other one is, we've named Lebanon, we've named Syria. Can you name some, and Matt named 22 countries. I don't want you to name 22 countries, but can you just give us what other countries, so that I don't make any assumptions and nor do our listeners?
We're talking about much of North Africa and Western Asia. So places like Yemen, Iraq, Syria, Morocco, Egypt, Libya, Jordan, Palestine, Lebanon. So, those are the main ones we find in the United States. It's quite diverse nationality-wise. Religion-wise, there's like a dozen different Christian denominations, as we've been referring to. There's a whole bunch of different practices of Islam. There's groups that are indigenous religions to Arab countries that have been practicing their religions there for thousands of years. We've got, we've got Zoroastrians, we've got Druze and other kinds of, and Yazidi, other kinds of religious practices that would be considered minorities in the US, but also minority religions even in Arab countries. So it is quite diverse, and Jewish, of course. There's a large historic Jewish population in many present-day Arab countries. But yeah, most people break it down as like a Christian-Muslim thing. And as Karen's saying, just because, so religious identity is big. A lot of people will look at somebody's last name and be like, oh, that's a Muslim last name or that's a Christian last name. But in reality, a lot of Arabs in the US are secular. And although they come from Muslim or Christian or Jewish traditions, they don't particularly practice it anymore. And so we have to recognize that there's like Jamil is talking about the religion, the cultural aspects of religion, but a lot of people also don't practice it in that way anymore.
I think it's important, the Jewish piece of the Arab mosaic, and there are Jewish people from Arab countries or Arab heritage who will call themselves Arab Jews. There are others who very much reject that identity, but have a strong identification with a particular homeland: Iraq, Syria, Morocco, Egypt, so forth. And I think because of the politics of the Arab-Israeli conflict and political Zionism and so forth, so many of us who may be Muslim or Christian or have experienced this sort of disconnect or divide with regards to Jews from Arab countries. And I always, lament that fact. I remember the first time that a Cuban Jewish friend of mine took me to the Syrian Jewish shul in Brooklyn. I thought I was in a kind of Jewish version of the church I grew up in, in terms of the dialect of Arabic that was being spoken and the way people were interacting and so forth. So I've always really mourned the fact that we all somehow have been led to believe that a piece of the mosaic has been severed. And it's sort of a project of mine within Silk Road to find theater makers and artists of Jewish theater makers of what we might call Mizrahi or Sephardic heritage, who are interested in joining what we broadly call Arab American community identity formation.
Is the term Arab something that other cultures and people have assigned to this group, or is this something self-identified that people are proud to call themselves?
This is what Jumana was referring to, in that the identity piece for our community is really varied and just nuanced. So Arab is an ethnic identity that is also entwined with a linguistic practice. And so we ascribe Arab identity to countries like, for instance, Morocco, although many people in those countries who might speak Arabic would not identify as Arab. They might say I'm Amazigh or Berber. They might say I'm another sort of indigenous culture that predates the arrival of Arabs or the Arab language to this area. So we can speak broadly about Arabs, but also recognize that there are people who might fall within that category that might not self-identify as Arab. Some people would choose to use their country of origin, their religious practice, a tribal identification, something other than maybe the term Arab. There was in the 1950s and 60s, there was a rise in this pan-Arab ethnic identity where people were trying to galvanize around a political Arab identity that wasn't so much rooted in ethnicity. That has sort of waned away today. In the US, there are a lot of groups from Lebanon, from Iraq, from Egypt that historically did not identify as Arab, that in the US, they don't use the term Arab. They might understand themselves as Middle Eastern. They might say, yes, my family speaks Arabic, but the term Arab is not how I identify. So at the museum, we use the term Arab American only to refer to those people who self-identify as Arab American. And that includes people you might not expect, and then also excludes people you might think would be Arab that don't take that label. So it's a fascinating discussion, and 10 years from now, Arab might mean something different to a lot of people as well. So it's always changing.
What I know, which is this local Dearborn community, which is heavily populated with Lebanese American community members. So when I was growing up, a lot of people from the community identified by their country of origin. So they didn't necessarily say they were Arab American. They identified by saying, "Oh, I'm from Palestine, I'm from Lebanon, I'm from Syria." And I found that this was to be true even as I got older. It wasn't really until I got into the museum and got into like more community based work and had conversations with the communities outside of my local like Dearborn community that they were using the term Arab American more. So I'm just naming that because it's something that I've noticed, and I don't, like as Matt was saying, it shifts. The way people identify shifts. But yeah, like growing up, like my experience with identification was people would identify by their country of origin, not necessarily saying that they're Arab American. Like I even the way I identify shifted. So I used to say I'm Lebanese, I'm Lebanese, I'm Lebanese. Now I tend to say I'm Arab American.
I have a similar story. When I moved here, I was Indian. I grew up in India, but my ancestry is Zoroastrian. And I kept getting, you don't look Indian. Are you Hindu or Muslim, right? It was just that binary because that's India at the time to the rest of the world. And then I had to explain the whole story. And so the same thing of like how one's migration starts shifting of our own self-identity as well. And now I have this Persian, Indian, American, because this seems more authentic to me in this moment.
I just want to say there are national groups like, Turks, Persians, Armenians, who oftentimes are assumed to be Arab. I cannot tell you the number of times that Iran has been explained to me as an Arab country, and I have to, correct that. In the community of North American theater makers who are interested in the stories of Middle Eastern peoples, I think we've done something over a period of years that in many ways is very revolutionary, thinking about creating these spaces where we could come together and hear each other's stories. And I just remember the power of being in a room where Turkish people are listening to stories of the Armenian genocide, and Israeli Jews are listening to stories of Palestinian displacement and occupation, and how we were able to connect on these very human levels through that storytelling tradition. So, we are seeing the emergence of an identity or identities that are acknowledging everything that connects us without erasing the cultural, linguistic, religious, so forth specificities. And also, those connections to South Asia, those connections to East Africa. I think that the consciousness is growing, and that tendency to think of ourselves as somehow enemies or rivals, or that we are in conflicted relationships with each other. Many of us would like to move beyond that. Many of us would like to see this kind of connectedness.
I think that's a great point, is this like coalitional identity. So Arabness is like, people, especially after 9/11, people were like, okay, I didn't really see myself as Arab, but now I see the power in enough of us saying, okay, I ascribe to this Arab group. I'm part of this Arab tent, this big tent of people that might include me, and the power that that has. But then also broadening that, as Jamil is saying, to MENA or SWANA, which includes people that have shared experiences and shared histories, and are also a shared way that they're perceived in the United States, so that it gets beyond ethnic identity and builds coalitions around movements and different understandings.
Would you share what MENA and SWANA stand for? And then there are other acronyms as well.
MENA is Middle East or North African, and SWANA is Southwest Asian or North African.
What I'm taking away from this conversation, as y'all have been diving into the complexities and richness of heritage of Arab countries, is how history has homogenized so many parts of the world just to make it palatable for folk who don't get it or don't want to make the effort to understand those complexities. And with homogenization comes stereotyping, and with stereotyping comes you people, right? So really appreciating the richness of parsing this out. I want to move us to, and some of you are already talking about this, but the value of story. Each of you, with what you do, is upholding storytelling of the community, right? Jamil, very literally and explicitly through co-founding a theater. Jumana, you being deputy director of a museum, upholding the stories of the past, right? Data tells stories, Matt, in terms of what you are doing. And then Karen, storytelling of current communities as an ERG leader of the globe, of bringing people together to, and you talk a lot about allies, and that space of how do we share of ourselves and where we come from and what's important to us. Could you speak a little bit about why now more than ever sharing these stories, upholding the stories, preserving these stories are so important given the global cacophony that we are in?
I don't know if I mentioned this, but one intention I had for this year was to focus on home, on community, on my roots, and to share that with like as many people as I can. And so this role as global lead has incentivized me to make proactive steps to create this diverse and inclusive culture that helps drive the future of organizations. Not every organization has the space to have that, helping colleagues feel valued because of their differences and not despite them, and learning from different perspectives. So professionally, it improves work conditions for alienated workers. It helps marginalized groups and remote workers feel connected through this common cause or interest, and creating the safe space for where conversations can flow freely and everyone can feel comfortable sharing their experience. And I can bring my whole self there. Like it helped me personally flourish and innovate and inspire me to celebrate my heritage, the richness of my Arab identity, the cultures, the experience, food, music, exploring art and trying to find a bookstore or finding a documentary that tackles this, and sharing those, right? And just honoring artists that share their heritage and intersecting identities. It just creates powerful work. Like, for example, earlier this year, unfortunately, there was the earthquake, the Syrian and Turkish earthquake, and it brought people together. They let go of everything that they separated them, if you will. And so, for example, with the ERG group, we had a volunteered no-sew blanket making event where we all came together and we dedicated time to help the survivors of the earthquake in Turkey and Syria. And these blankets were delivered to relief centers in Turkey and Syria. And it was just so heartwarming to see us all rally and support this cause, vis-a-vis our allies.
One of the reasons why we feel like the museum is important and why the museum exists is because we can use storytelling and personal stories and reflections in the museum, and that artists and community can tell the story and we can give them space. So, back before the museum was in creation, there was a conversation about how to tell our story, how to control, when I say our, I mean the Arab American story, how to take back our narrative from the media, from others who were speaking on our behalf. And there was a call in for action. A lot of community leaders across the country who had ties with Access came together and, post 9/11, and started having conversations about what does our community need in order to be empowered to share their story, to tell their story, to take back their narrative. And that's kind of how, one of the ways in which the museum came to be, is out of this movement to take back control over this narrative. So when the museum opened its doors in 2005, one of the things that we love to share is that we didn't have to really go out to get stories per se, or we didn't have to purchase objects, or we didn't have to find ways to fill our walls and fill our spaces. When we put the call out, people came to us. They wanted to share their stories. They wanted to give us objects that reflect how, like, their migration story or their immigration story or their grandparents' stories, whatever the case may be. And pretty soon our walls filled with objects and storytelling. So our museum is unique in the sense where it's not like a traditional museum. You're not going to walk in and see you will see pretty art from artists we commission, but that's not like our permanent exhibits are more so of storytelling and object collection. And it's one of the unique things I think about our museum. And then we give the artists, we're able to partner with the artists and call in artists and commission artists and elevate Arab American artists to come by giving them, space in the museum to make it pretty, to tell their stories, to give them an opportunity, to share. We can't necessarily always be political per se, but the artists can. We can invite them in and they can use their art to address issues that are happening either in the current state of the Arab world or with current issues affecting Arab Americans. So that's one of the beautiful things about what how we're able to use the museum, and how we're able to also offer artists, especially Arab American artists who, may have struggled to be seen or heard or find space. Here, come, let's work together. Let's share your story. So I think this art of storytelling is sometimes overlooked, but it's so powerful. We have an artist in residency program through the museum, which gives us the opportunity to work with different artists from a variety of mediums. You don't have to be Arab American necessarily to be part of the artist in residence, but your work has to reflect something that ties into either the Arab world or something Arab American. And we give the artists the opportunity to place make as well. So we partner them, like, they can work in the university or with a high school or with community or writing workshops. So part of the work that they're doing while they're here is working on their particular work, but also we connect them with the community so that we bring in the community and they can be part of the process and they can learn from the artists. So and then just lastly, one of the areas that Matt is overseeing is our oral history collection. So we have two amazing oral historians that are traveling across the country and collecting stories and finding those little unique stories that exist about immigration, or that cool object that we may not have heard about if they were able to go and collect them. So I just wanted to also share that one of the things the museum has been working on, and just the importance of storytelling and reclaiming our narratives and representation.
Within days of 9/11, of the attacks, Japanese American leaders were writing op-ed pieces that were showing up in newspapers across the country, warning about scapegoating, and essentially saying, we know scapegoating and Pearl Harbor and the incarceration, and for us that was such an extraordinary show of allyship, of solidarity, of coalition building, people reaching out and saying, do not do to this community what was done to us. And I have often said that Japanese American incarceration lives in the DNA of Silk Road Rising. We have worked on several projects with Japanese American playwrights to tell this story. And it has been, a very important through line in terms of looking at how racism and fear and xenophobia manifest as really ugly policies. So, once again, that piece about solidarity, that piece about connectivity, and finding our stories in other people's stories and them finding their stories in our stories has been so critical to the work we do. We have something called the playwright protagonist alignment, which is that the playwright and the protagonist, or the central character, share a heritage. They share a cultural background. It was never meant to be like celebratory work, like, oh, it's great to be Arab or it's great to be Indian. It was always about complicated, complex, three-dimensional stories and giving artists the space to not carry the burden of representing everyone all at once, but to really explore, their own truths and their own relationship to culture, to family, to community, to belonging, so forth.
I live in the world of data and how data does or does not represent the community in the United States, and right now it really doesn't in many ways. And so trying to use what little data we have to tell the stories of why we need more data. And, I'm not just talking about like US Census. We're talking about numbers of Arabs and MENA folks who are fighting specific diseases, who are, incarcerated, or drug overdoses, or there's all the kinds of data that our community just doesn't show up in. And so it's really hard to tell the full story of our community. So we advocate for better data across all of these fields, but with the little data we do have, we try to tell the stories that hopefully show why we need more, and how our experiences, our community's experiences, are unique and deserve to be, disaggregated from the white racial box, which is where most Arab and MENA folks are placed in right now.
One of the crucial legislative initiatives that Arab leaders within the United States have been working on for, correct me if I'm wrong, decades, is to get the community its own space in the US Census, which has still not happened. To your point about, creating the unique, gathering unique data to make the case for why we need more data, can you break that down for us as to why that is important? What happens when there is no data for a community? What does that imply?
Well, without the data, I mean, in many ways, especially to the people who make decisions about funding, decisions about representation, the community doesn't exist if there's no data. I like to use the example of Dearborn, Michigan. So Dearborn, Michigan has the distinction of being the city with the highest per capita population of Arab Americans in the country. We estimate, because we don't know the real numbers because there's no data, we estimate that the city of Dearborn, which has about 100,000 people, is probably 65 to 75% Arab. And we know that since the Arab community is younger on average than the rest of the population and has more children than the rest of the population, especially the white population, that the Dearborn City schools is probably like 85% Arab. But if you go to the National Center for Education Statistics, it says that Dearborn City schools are 85% white, because they don't disaggregate for Arab or MENA. And so it's really hard to make the case about the needs of a community when it's just seen as all white. And while it is true that many Arabs do look phenotypically white and are white passing in many ways, and I also identify as white because I'm only part Arab, that as a whole, the community's issues are and their demographics are distinct from the white community in many ways, and we have the research that shows this. It's just a matter of disaggregating, taking the Arab identities out of white, making their own category so we can really see what's going on and where the issues are.
I really do believe that Arab Americans and Arab Canadians are positioned to enter the conversation around whiteness with a very unique and important positionality or vantage point. And I would certainly like to see more of that, and how we kind of, deconstruct this almost monolithic category of white or whiteness and parse that and really, look at the political projects that were so baked in to creating whiteness and which so many Arabs did not benefit from, and which Arabs paid a significant price for. So just, I want to put that out there. I'd like to see, I guess, us as a community be more proactive, but at the same time, when we're sort of conflated with this broader category, it becomes very difficult to argue for our own perspective and experience.
Being forced to move out of homelands for whatever reasons, maybe not forced, maybe out of choice as well, and then coming to a new land, working through the assimilation process, integration process, and then this space of, again, a sort of erasure, a sort of homogenizing, right? I mean, if you look at the history of the US Census, there were two boxes to check. You were either white or Black. And so the Asian Pacific Islander API communities had to check white for generations until they got their own space. And the implications of that were so many of the community, again, that mindset of, oh, I'm white, because that's what I check off, and the connection to those pieces. And every part of the world has some form of this, what we're calling colorism here, when our proximity to whiteness, our proximity to darker skin, brownness, Blackness, and then moving into the space of anti-Blackness and the highest levels of oppression there. Could you educate us, for lack of a better term, or could you give us some context around how this shows up in the vastness of Arab heritage?
This idea of whiteness and how it shows up, if you look at historically, and I'm sure this affected many other communities, but just, we always joke around in like the Arab American communities, like Muhammad's go by Mike, Ahmed's go by Adam, Ali's go by Al. So even in the name, people, I think when they first came over, and they saw, they didn't want to be treated differently, or they saw that if you looked a different way, or if you had a name that was hard to pronounce, it may have limited you from reaching a higher position or getting called in for an interview, or just like in the workplace, people who are lighter skinned maybe got better positions or treated differently. So just going back again to like personal example. So when my dad came over from Lebanon and started working at Ford Motor Company, his name is Ahmed, but when his foreman or somebody would call the house, or when he would take us, once, I remember like growing up, once a year, they did like an open house, and you could bring your families and show them like where you worked and meet your, show them the ins and out of Ford. Nobody called him Ahmed, everyone called him Mike. And he called himself Mike because he was like, oh, people can't pronounce my name anyways. And it's funny because I think it's true for all immigrants. Like when you come here and you're trying to assimilate, you want it to be easier for others. So like changing the name wasn't only a way that whiteness showed up, but it was also to make it easier for people who couldn't speak the language to say your name, because, again, whiteness showing up, you don't want them, you want to make it easier for them to communicate with you. So how do you do that? You change your name, or your your mannerisms, or you don't use your language, or whatever the case may be, to make it easier for others. So, that's just an example growing up of how I saw in my community, like whiteness showing up. And then also, again, there wasn't this category of brown when I was coming up. It was like you're either black or you're white. And, in the community, black, was like, oh, you don't want to be associated with being darker skinned or being black. You wanted to be associated with being white, because again, this is how systematically how whiteness is showing up. And it wasn't, I think, until I started diving into some DEI work and getting familiar with communities of color who don't necessarily identify as black, but are definitely not white, such as the Arab American community, this colorism of brown. And even, as I was working through that personally, I had a difficult time because I've never used that label as brown. So I started thinking, like, what is my responsibility by saying that I belong to, the brown community? What does that mean in the way I show up for not only the brown community, but the way I show up for the black community? I'm lighter complected in terms of like a lot of Arab Americans. So I never would look at my skin necessarily and say like I'm brown. I was like, oh yeah, I'm lighter, I'm white. And then, again, when I started this work, it was brought to my attention by one of the facilitators I was working with. It's like, no, you're not white, you're definitely brown. So I was put into a brown affinity group, and we were talking about systematic racism, and again, how whiteness shows up, and you might not realize it. And that's what I realized. I'm not white is when people around me that identified as brown were in this affinity group and talking about their experiences and their identities, and I was like, yes, this is me. I'm definitely not white. And just lastly, I just wanted to add is again, because I work in the museum, and we're the only museum in the country that focuses on the elevating the Arab American story and documenting the Arab American story. I think when the museum first opened, the landscape was a bit different. The communities that we engaged with were different. So we had a lot of communities coming through that were from Lebanon or Syria, or from like, what Matt refers to as referred to earlier as like the Levant area. The last like 5 to 8 years, we started seeing more communities show up from Sudan, Somalia, the North African region, and they actually, we're wondering, like, we don't see ourselves in your museum. We're Arab. We also identify as Black. We're Afro-Arab. That's a term that was introduced to me through talking, with communities. Now we're trying to be more intentional and getting those stories and calling those communities in and having them feel that this is a place for them, because again, we have been criticized for being too Levant or not sharing the story of the Black experience in the museum. So we definitely want to be more inclusive and bring those stories in as well. So colorism even shows up within the Arab community because of the geographic regions, and because you could be from the North African region, you could be from like the Levant area, from other parts. Like my sister's has blue eyes and light brown hair and fair skin. And then like I have my brother's has more of like the olive complexion and the darker hair color. So even within our family, the families, it changes.
I have a funny anecdote that Jumana made me think of because of the whole name thing. In the last year, I've had multiple instances where someone was asking me my name, and I was like, my name's Karen, and they're like, no, it's not. I was like, what do you mean? They're like, you don't look like your name's Karen. It's like you have darker complexion and curly hair, and so like, what do you want my name to, like, what is my name? Is it, you want my name to be Amira? Like, it's just on the flip side of people who have like an Arab name, maybe hard to pronounce for Westerners, and then Muhammad, Mike, and then Karen, but I'm Arabic, like I'm Arab and I speak Arabic, and they're like, they just didn't believe me. It was hard for people to believe that I had this name, and it just made me think, like people's eyes and people's perspectives and how they see us is important.
And then in the US, the name Karen has taken on a whole other
the
situation.
whole meme.
My goodness, we're not gonna get
I'm not
into
a Karen, I promise.
like that's not Karen bit, right?
That's
So,
that's a whole other story. Like
other thing. Yes.
I cannot tell you the number of times I have told someone my name and they have repeated it back to me as Jimmy Khoury. So they hear this very Irish name, and it's happened for years, completely, unrelated situations. This was the summer before I started grad school. I had signed up with some temp agency in Chicago, and they sent me to a bank, and the person who was, I guess, the supervisor for this program with the temps, came into the whatever waiting room to meet me, and she said, "Oh, thank God. We were so worried you were Black." She, had no problem saying that. I, at the first break of the day, called the temp agency and I said, I think you need to know that this is how I was greeted. And it was like tremendous relief, and they were all very happy that and the agency just said, oh yeah, they seem to really like you. So it completely went over. But that sort of assumption with names that gets made. And I have to tell you, I also had a situation many years ago when I was trying to get an apartment, and I was using my name and I wasn't getting calls back. And then I changed, I used the name Jim or Jimmy or James, which I don't like doing because it's not my name. And then people would call right away. And I really don't think that was anti-Arab. I think that was anti-Black. I mean, I could be wrong, but that was, yeah. So I have experienced that, you know, in a number of ways.
So, Franz, can I ask, every, you know, having grown up where I did, every community has some form of this. Can you speak to a little bit around what is the responsibility? And also, I want to acknowledge that over here we have a light-skinned representation. We have a heavy Lebanon representation. We, as just representation on this, you know, list of guest speakers, we don't have all of Arab heritage represented, and specifically, we don't have the countries represented that are darker skinned. So it's really important to. We always say in our work that we do with clients to always consider who's not in the room, who's not being considered, whose perspective should we add into this conversation. So this is that moment. Given where the United States is, where the West is, where we're going in global conversation around belonging and inclusion, and what does it take to truly have roots, what is the responsibility here for all communities? And then not, of course, speaking for all communities, but specifically for Arab communities, per your perspective, because you've taken on a leadership role of responsibility to uphold heritage, to uphold storytelling, right? So can you speak to that piece with, as an immigrant community in a land of immigrants in the West, what is the responsibility to, in this vein of colorism, proximity to whiteness, anti-Blackness, what is the community's responsibility? Where do we need to go further?
You know, I'm a historian by training, and I always, even though I work a lot with like public health data right now, I think that this understanding of there's nothing new under the sun. The things the community are dealing with now have been going on for, you know, well over a century. Trump's Muslim ban was not the first time that our community was barred from immigrating. It's not the first time that Muslims were kept out of U.S. civil participation. So, you know, always bringing into the room that this has been going on for a long time, and we need to be aware of that history. And then definitely what Jamil was saying about, you know, the Japanese community, who's always been a close ally of the Arab and Muslim community in the U.S., is knowing how our fight intersects with other people's fights, and we need to show up for other communities, or we can't expect them to come to us when we need assistance. So, you know, making sure our own history is understood and what that means for our understanding also of how our current mode is in relation to other communities and their fights.
We also can name internally that racism exists, or anti-Blackness exists, or anti-whatever exists. Being from the Arab world, it's very complex. I think like even within like the Muslim community, there's a division between like Sunni and Shia, or I'm sure it exists also within the Christian denominations. And there's also some, you know, biases and racism that can exist even within our own communities that I think we need to be comfortable addressing. We need to have those, we need to be uncomfortable and to get comfortable in having those discussions and name what, you know, what exists within our communities. And that's kind of like my personal, like what happened like with my personal DEI trajectory was like I had to get comfortable naming you know, things that were happening in my life and things that I was carrying, and, you know, intergenerational trauma and like all of that stuff that gets passed on. And then from there, I was then able to figure out how I can show up, as Matt said, and be an ally. Because, you know, you can't, like for me personally, I didn't feel I could be an ally or show up for other communities when I didn't understand what was going on within my own, and try to figure out how to get people to have these difficult conversations, which, you know, they're difficult and nobody wants to admit like they were, you know, they have these biasisms or racisms, or we're carrying the intergenerational traumas or happenings. I think once we're able to have those conversations and call, I really like, you know, this idea of calling in people versus calling out. Like, let's call each other in and figure out, and then we can have the conversations about being allies for others. And what does that look like? Because again, we can't expect, you know, people to protest and hit the streets for us if we're not doing it for others.
The showing up part that, you know, has been mentioned is so important, you know, and even if we're not fully versed, I mean, this is something we've certainly learned in sort of putting together this Silk Road identity of this, you know, vast territories and contiguity and peoples who are somehow connected, is that it does matter when, you know, our bodies are in the room, and I think that when people know others have your back or we have their back, it does manifest as collaboration, as coalition, as and there's so much out there trying to pit us against each other and divide us and you know, undermine. And so I think that just being part of our consciousness, like, well, this is how we do our work, and we are going to be mindful of people who are suffering more than we are, and, you know, who are at a greater disadvantage.
As I'm learning about myself and about the importance of like my name and the importance of how I want to carry myself, I wanted to make sure like I gave my boys, who now I say I'm a mother of 2 brown boys, you know, to be proud of where they come from. So I named my children Kareem and Ziad, and I wanted to make sure that they had names that also, you know, speak to their culture, their religion, and that they can be proud of. So that's something also I feel I've learned along the way with my identity journey, is the importance of that too, is what the work we're doing now is going to impact our children.
We got to leave the world slightly better so that they could have fun as much as possible. The fact that identity is fluid, that it is evolving and shifting and changing depending on our lived experience, where we end up in the world, who is around us, what our influences are, right? So thank you for putting that in such a beautiful personal perspective. I just want to say thank you to each of you, Matt, Jamil, Karen, Jumana. So rich, and there's so much love for this conversation in the chat. You know, people shouting out the deep levels of intersectionality and nuance and complexity that has been surfaced. Thank you all again.
Thank you for organizing this.
Mhm.
Pleasure.
Yeah, thank you
pleasure.
so much
Yeah,
for
thank you to
having
you and your
us.
team.
Be well, everyone. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
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 Bye.